Hello and welcome to this demonstration of this PEEEEEEW paragraph using the poem My Mistress' Eyes Are Nothing Like the Sun. So, our question that we're going to pretend that we're answering is, how does the author's use of connotation develop his tone? So, the first thing that you need to do when you've got a question and you've got words in there that are in your literary device handbook, you should use your literary device handbook to figure those words out and make sure that you understand the question. So, on page 7, we have the word tone. So, tone means, remember, the author's attitude. And since you can't see an author's attitude on paper like you can see on somebody's face or hearing their words, it makes sense that we're considering connotation as well. Remember, connotation is when a word has an emotional meaning that goes beyond the dictionary meaning. So, diction is just the author's word choice. Get it? He chooses a word from the dictionary. That's his diction. Connotation is the emotional value that uses. So, let's see if we can remember. When we read My Mistress' Eyes Are Nothing Like the Sun, remember you guys pretty much, when you color-coded it, had the first 12 lines or so of the poem in red, because the author is saying a lot of things that have a negative emotion or a negative connotation attached to them. Remember, he says her eyes aren't pretty in the first line, her eyes are nothing like the sun, that her lips aren't the prettiest red, that her complexion is all gray. Remember, dun means like ashy. Calls her hairs black wires. In the next couple of lines, he says that her cheeks don't look rosy red. And then in the next couple of lines, he says that her breath reeks. And then finally, her voice is not as pleasing as music, and that she treads on the ground da-dum, 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 when she walks. She is not graceful like a goddess. And so you pretty much coded all of this as red because it sounds really negative. And so the last two lines, it takes an interesting turn. Remember, we said the last two lines, and yet by heaven, I think my love is rare, as any she will I with false compare, have a really positive connotation. Because he's saying that he loves her and that he thinks she would be misrepresented, that's what belied means, with all of these false comparisons. So let's see how we can use that information to answer our question. How does the author's use of connotation develop his tone? Well, I don't even think his tone is necessarily toward his mistress. I think his tone is actually toward people who believe that you can make these false comparisons and develop a real relationship. So, let's remember, what are we going to put in a preview sentence? Well, we need the author's name, we need the title, we need a keyword, easy peasy lemon squeezy, just rewrite the question for that, and we need a brief answer. So here's what I've come up with. In William Shakespeare's Sonnet 130, his use of connotation, that came straight from my question, develops his tone, also straight from my question. Here's my brief answer to the question. Towards the false standards of beauty and perfection that many believe are necessary for a relationship. So remember, I've got four things. William Shakespeare, there's my author's name. Sonnet 130, there's my title. Use of connotation develops his tone toward the false standards of use of connotation develops his tone. There's my rewriting the question as my answer. And then, towards the false standards of beauty and perfection that many believe are necessary for a great relationship is me hinting at the answer. So I got my four things that I have to have in my previous sentence. So my next sentence is going to be an example. Remember, I need to be specific. I need to use a direct quote. I need to use ties to incorporate my quote. I'll teach you more about that later. And I need to cite my source. I'll also teach you more about that later. So remember, my question is, how does the author's use of connotation develop his tone? So my example should be an example of his connotation. We have two different types of connotation in this poem. We have the first 12 lines with all the negative connotations, and we have the last two lines with our positive connotation. So I'm going to focus on a few of the negative examples from the first 12 lines in my first example. And I'm going to say, throughout the first 12 lines of the poem, Shakespeare oddly compares his mistress' hair to black wires, says that her breath reeks, and notes that her complexion is dun. So notice that I have these teeny tiny quotes throughout my sentence. I actually use three specific examples. and I drop them in throughout my sentence like chocolate chips in a chocolate chip cookie. So notice that I also put quotation marks around them and that I put my citation at the end. Now in this citation, I don't have to put Shakespeare, which is my author's last name, because I have used Shakespeare in my sentence. So all I have to do is put the line numbers for my quote. So I have finished with my first example. So what do I do next? I need to give an explanation. That's where I'm going to write at least 2 sentences that prove that my previous sentence is true. So let's think, what does my previous sentence say? I have it here in green. My previous sentence makes the statement that it's really his tone toward the false standards of beauty and perfection that many believe are necessary for a great relationship. So for my explanation sentence is, I need to make sure that I'm showing that those false standards of beauty are actually false. So I say, oddly, these images have a negative connotation and make it seem like Shakespeare is insulting his mistress. Most love poems are laden with positive images that describe an unrealistic beauty and perfection of the loved one. So I'm kind of getting in there on the false standards of beauty and perfection, and I'm leading my reader, just like Shakespeare does, to the last 2 lines of the poem, which bring me to my next sentence, which has to be an example. Once again, I need to be specific. Since it's my second example, I need to start the second example with a transition word. Once again, I need to use a direct quote. I'm going to use ties, tag, introduce, embed, or split. I'll teach you more about that later to incorporate your quote. And once again, I need to cite my source. So since I have used examples from the first 12 lines of the poem to show how he's being negative, it only makes sense that my second example be something from the little positive section at the end where his tone seems to take a twist. So my transition word is going to be unique to my sentence. I'm going to use the transition word that you see here in bold, although Shakespeare's tone seems negative. So I'm not actually using a word, I'm actually using a transition phrase that's saying, hey, even though this is true, check out what I'm about to say. And my 2 sentences are going to say, it takes a positive turn at the end of the poem. Sorry, my 1 sentence for my example. It takes a positive turn at the end of the poem when he says, and yet by heaven I think my love as rare as any she belied with false compare. So I pretty much quoted the one section of the poem where it turns into a clear positive tone, because that's my question. How does this connotation develop tone? So now I'm ready to give my explanation sentences. Once again, I need to write at least 2 sentences and prove that my previous sentence is true. So what does my previous sentence say? Let's look at it again in green. My previous sentence says that his use of connotation develops his tone towards the false standards of beauty and perfection that many believe are necessary for a great relationship. So in my explanation sentences, I need to show what my example has to do with that, his tone toward the false standards of beauty and perfection. So here's what I say. Unlike the traditional poems and love songs that celebrate perfection, the speaker in this poem notes that his love toward his imperfect mistress is rare. Instead of expecting her to be perfect, he seems to focus on how he loves her, just like she is, instead of expecting her to meet society's unrealistic expectations. Whew, this P is coming on pretty good. All right, so what do I do? It's been a long P. When you have to pee that much, whew, is what you say at the end. So that's what we're going to do next. Our W stands for wrap it up. So remember, we're going to think about what our 2 examples have in common. And we're going to say something about that to answer the question and wrap up the paragraph. At the end of your paragraph, you do not want to give another quote or example in this very last sentence. If you do, then you need to explain it and wrap it up after that. And you also do not want to just repeat what you've already said. So let's remember our question. It's how does the author's use of connotation develop his tone? So let's think. My first example is about how his tone is negative. My second example is about how he loves her like she is. So what do those 2 have in common? Well, those 2 seem to show, if you think about it, that he's saying that you can't expect somebody to be perfect, to be worthy of love. Notice that I'm doing the same thing here that I expect you to do when we're making level 1, 2, and 3 annotations. Level 1, I have quotes in my examples. Level 2, I'm asking you to put 2 and 2 together. Level 3, in your W, I'm pretty much asking you to connect it to the world because our question is asking you about purpose. So here's what I came up with. Shakespeare's negative tone in the poem is not directed toward his mistress. Instead, it is directed toward society. He recognizes that no one in a relationship can be perfect, and instead he pokes fun of anyone who may believe that this standard is realistic in a relationship. So that way, my wrap it up sentence is, I actually needed 2 sentences to say all that I needed to say here, and that's perfectly fine. But my wrap it up answers the question, and it connects it to the world. Often you'll want to do that in your wrap it up. If you'll connect it to the world, then especially if your question is asking you something about purpose, you'll be sure to be answering your question. So in the next assignment on the agenda, I ask you to color code this paragraph. You can pause the video right here at this screen and get your color coding on and turn in that document in its Dropbox.